Parnell back with our second part of the motivation notes, and this is on section 2, which is hunger. And this is the one where I give you time to write stuff down as we go through. All right, so the first part's talking about this experiment, and they actually talked about it in the crash course. When you watch the crash course before the last section of the PowerPoint notes, you saw this. But basically, there was this guy, Ancel Keys, and he did this experiment with men who refused to enlist during the Korean War for like objections of some reason. They could be in this study. And so basically what he did was like 3 months of feeding them normal. I remember if it was I think it was 3 months of feeding them half of what they normally ate, and then 3 months of normal, something like that. Anyways, what he found was that these men, as you can see in the pictures right there, I mean, he starved. I mean, he did like a starvation study. And they became 25% underweight and all this kind of stuff that you would normally expect. But some of the things that surprised them was how obsessed the men became with food, men who were not eating. They said it was all they could think about, all they could talk about, all they could dream about, all they could picture. And it was just like every part of their waking moment had to do with food. So this is kind of going back to the last thing we did. We're talking about Maslow and those levels. Remember, foods at the bottom was physiological. And, you know, Maslow says, until you meet it, you're not going to be able to move on. Well, that's what these gentlemen were doing. Like, they weren't able to process or think of anything else other than food. And they didn't want to do anything else. Then he the kind of interesting part, actually, I think I'd talk about it later in the PowerPoint, is he brings them back and lets them eat and stuff like that. And it's kind of how much weight they gained and lost and stuff you'll see. So there's 2 parts. I think there's 3 parts of this slide. So if you look up at the top right now, we're going to talk about the physiological components of hunger, the physiology of hunger. So we're talking about physical inside the body, the nature part, if you want to think about it. So what triggers hunger? So you've heard of hunger pangs before. Is it that of an empty stomach? And this guy named A.L. Washburn swallowed an empty balloon, and then what he did is he inflated it. And the balloon was attached to a machine outside of his body. And so the balloon could register when the stomach contracted, aka like when your stomach growls, you know, and stuff like that, rumbles and you're hungry. And it did that. But also, aside from that, he was supposed to press a button every time in his brain he wanted to eat, he felt hungry, he thought about food, like that type of thing. And as you can see, when they kind of mapped it out, like here's like the hunger pangs, right? And like the stomach contraction is what's causing that. And then that would also be the time, or I'm sorry, here's the stomach contraction. The hunger pangs are what he's pressing. And so they're going hand in hand if you look like the timing and stuff like that. So it shows that there is definitely a physical component to hunger and stuff like that. So here's where we'll start writing some stuff. So blood sugar, you probably heard of before, glucose. It's the way that our body attempts to stay at that homeostasis point, you know, not be too hungry, not be too full that we talked about earlier and stuff. So let's write that down. All right, so you got glucose as your first definition. And what glucose is a form of sugar that circulates in the blood and provides the major source of energy for body tissue. So glucose is sugar in your blood, like it says, and it's what gives us our energy to keep us going and stuff like that. So when it gets too low is when you don't have any energy and you're hungry and you're like, oh, I can't focus, I have no energy, I'm lethargic, you know, so, you know, that type of thing. So insulin is made by the pancreas, and it kind of works hand in hand with this. So an increase in insulin would actually lower the blood sugar, and when that happens, when the blood sugar is lowering, it's like converting it into like stored fat and stuff like that. Again, this is a little bit kind of above my pay grade, but this is kind of how I understand it and the way your book explains it and stuff. And when that happens, that's what triggers your brain to feel hunger, when that blood sugar, the glucose, drops. So many parts of the brain are related to hunger, including mainly the hypothalamus. Write that down somewhere in there, that hypothalamus is part of your brain related to this. So if you remember back to the second unit, unit 2, Brain and body. When we're talking about the brain, we're talking about the hypothalamus. So like very center of your brain, remember brainstem going up into your brain, limbic system kind of wrapping around it. You had this like knot ball on the top that was your thalamus, that was like the relay center to all the different lobes and parts of the brain. Limbic center is kind of wrapping around the brainstem right below it. So you got the prefix hypo as in below, and it hangs off there right below the thalamus. So that's why it's called hypothalamus. And remember, it controlled all those basic, just kind of basic, I don't know, what's the word, like things about us. Sorry, I can't think of a good word. Like our body temperature, thirst, hunger, stuff like that. So you can see with hunger, the hypothalamus is one of the main parts. When you read in your book, they go way more in depth on part of the brains that we didn't even talk about in Unit 2, and I'm not making you write that down. There's a picture in your book with like all the different parts, even in your stomach and digestion and different organs like the pancreas and stuff that like have all these basically different types of hormones, neurotransmitters, stuff like that. They secrete and stuff, and I'm not making you go that in depth because again, that's like whoosh over my head, and I've never seen anyone needing to know that for an exam or anything. So as long as you just kind of have the basic with the blood sugar and stuff like that. The other thing they talk about is something called a set point. So let's write this down. All right, so set point. It is the point at which your weight thermostat, I need to put quotes on both of those. It's kind of like your weight thermometer, you know, thermostat in your house. Your weight thermostat is supposedly set. So according to this, we all have different set points, right? And that's why some people are just bigger than others. And it's not even necessarily like talking about like a fat versus skinny thing or a tall versus short thing. Some people are just literally, I know we call it like big boned or something sometimes. Some people are just larger than other people, but they don't look bad or anything like that. They don't look out of shape. They don't look fat. They don't look stuff like that. And that's like their set point, and that's their size and their bodies being, you know, the most healthy and optimizing, and it goes with how much they eat and their genetics and stuff like that. And then some people's are just smaller. And sometimes when you see people get outside of their set points, like, you know, someone who is just larger get down really skinny, it doesn't look good. Like maybe you would think a typical person would look skinny or something. Or, you know, like some people when they get larger, it looks a lot more noticeable or not as good as then when other people do. It's kind of like that. So it's like you have this range that your body does the best in, and you can move it outside that range based on life choices, obviously. But when you get outside that range, you can tell it's not cohesive and stuff like that. But there's still more to your definition. All right. So when your body falls below this weight, so when your body falls below this weight, increased hunger and lowered metabolic rate may combine to restore the lost weight. And the second part is kind of explaining like why it's hard to lose weight, because like say you really did stuff, whether it was like starving or something you shouldn't do, to get yourself out of that range, get yourself lower, make yourself skinny or whatever. It's like your body has these like fail safes, you know, like in place and stuff like that. And so your metabolic rate's going to like, you know, turn on, and it's going to try and restore the lost weight so you don't actually lose the weight, and it restores you back to where you should be with your set point, like stuff like that. So it's not to say you couldn't like get outside of your set point, because you see people do, but it's really, really difficult. And within the set point range, it's a range, it's not like an exact number. People fluctuate with their weight pretty easily. Like they can go up 5 or 10 pounds or down 5 or 10 pounds, depending on like some exercise or how they eat and stuff. But to move outside of that one way or another would really take some effort. All right, so our bodies regulate weight through the control of food intake and the energy output in our basal metabolic rate. We're just kind of talking about a metabolic rate just a second ago. And so your basal metabolic rate, so this is what this means. We'll write it down in a second. It is how much your body like goes through stuff, right? It's kind of related to metabolism and stuff like that. It's like how fast your body expends energy, like how fast your body, when you're just resting, when you're just sitting here doing nothing, like you're sitting there taking notes right now, your body is burning some energy. And so it's just that rate. Like some people's are faster and those people tend to be skinnier, and some people's are slower and those people maybe are more sluggish or more overweight or stuff like that. And it's your body's like rate at which it runs pretty much. All right, so let's write that down. So basal metabolic rate. And then what you write for that is the body's resting rate of energy expenditure. So in Key's experiment, this is what I was talking about from the first slide. At the end of the 6 months total, so 3 months of eating normal, 3 months of having exactly what you could eat cut in half, the men were, now you would think they would go lower than this, but they were only at 75% of their normal weight, even though they were eating 50%. Now, you probably wouldn't expect a man who's 200 pounds to fall to 100 pounds. You know, you're eating 50%, you get 50% smaller. And then life's not that perfect. But they, for as lot as they were, you know, let me say that again. For as little as they were eating, for as lot as they were being starved, they did not lose that much weight. Now some did, we saw in the pictures and stuff like that, but when they came back to normal and started eating again, they were at like 75%. So I guess it was a good weight loss, you know, thing. And it was because their basal metabolic rate dropped. So we're going to see in a little bit on a slide. So if you're a bigger person, your basal metabolic rate is slower because it just runs slower. And people who are more muscular or leaner, it doesn't necessarily mean skinnier. It's kind of like a fat versus muscle thing. Their basal metabolic rate's faster and higher because it takes more energy to burn, you know, to keep the muscles active and moving and this and that. So it's like if you have two people and one's more muscular and they can both be sitting here, and the more muscular person's literally burning more weight as they sit here than the larger, fattier person. And it's kind of sad because it's like, well, that's the person that needs to be losing more weight or burning through more stuff. And so it kind of shows like the cyclical downfall of, like, you know, when someone gets to be overweight or obese and stuff, it's not just as easy. It's not very easy to fix because you have things like this working against you, where when you're not working out, you're not burning as much as someone who does work out. When they're not working out, they're still burning more. It almost like doesn't seem fair, you know? So still talking about, so finishing up the physiology of hunger, now moving into the psychology of hunger. So critics have claimed you can't prove the set point theory, right? Like over time, if you expose people, say you move to a different part of the country, world, family, got married, were around different stuff and eating totally different, and that happened over an extended period of time, then you could change your weight for the better or worse. And a lot of people, you know, change it for the worse. They overeat more, they eat worse foods for them, they gain more weight, stuff like that. So they say you can't really prove a set point exists because you can change it over an extended period of time in your life. So they say it's more like wherever you're at right now, like environmentally and stuff, it's like a settling point. You know, this stage of life based on what you're eating, where you're at, where you live. Like sometimes you're stressed or you don't have time to cook, or you live in a place where someone's throwing all this terrible free food at you all the time, so you eat it. But then sometimes people are in seasons of their life where they eat really good or have time to work out, or, you know, or cooking healthy meals, or can afford to get like really healthy frou-frou meals, stuff like that. So moving into the psychology parts, now we're going to move into the nurture parts. We just did nature. Now we're going to do nurture. There's more to hunger than just our physiological state. Our environment can be influential, like just remembering the last time you ate. Like, oh, it's been forever since I've ate. I need to eat, even if you're not hungry or something like that. Being, again, like exposed to certain foods. People in the southern part of the United States tend to be more obese than people in the north or people out west. And if you look at, like, you know, like cultural foods or like regional foods, like there's way more fried food here, there's way more stuff like that, and those are things that are worse for you. Those are things that can lead to an increased weight. And so, you know, it's your environment. If you lived, you know, in Colorado or California where everybody biked and ran and ate all organic and did this, that, and the other, and that was all you had available, you might look a lot different than if you lived, you know, in a really poverty-stricken part of Louisiana or Alabama where, you know, people get the majority of their food from like dollar stores and stuff like that. Everything's prepackaged, full of preservatives. And if they go to a restaurant, it's all fried. You know, it's like totally different. So, that should say psychology. That should say psychology of hunger. Sorry, just didn't change title. I'll go back and do it. So our body chemistry and our environmental factors influence our taste preferences as well. So when we're tense, stressed, depressed, down, stuff like that, people tend to crave starchy carbohydrate foods because it really does in your brain, it really does activate a part of your brain. Carbohydrates do, and which makes you feel better. And so when you're tensed or stressed or depressed, you want to feel better. And you notice when you eat these foods, you feel better, albeit temporarily, but you feel better. So that's why people, I mean, your book talks about like how Oreos really do make people feel better and stuff like that, because it works with the neurotransmitter serotonin. And serotonin, if you remember, is the one related to mood. So like people who are depressed, clinically depressed, have lower levels of serotonin, and stuff like that. So here you go. Our preference for sweet and salty food is pretty universal across the world. People prefer sweet and salty food. Once you get into like spicy food or this or that and the other, that's where it gets more cultural, regional, environmental, stuff like that. But no matter where you go in the world, people like sugar and starches. So that's your sweet and salty kind of stuff, your chips and your M&Ms. So it's especially true among different cultures. So our environment, our exposure, and our expectations influence our taste. So for instance, cultures that tend to like spicy foods, they tend to be, now it's not to say you had to grow up in one of these climates. And if you grew up way, way up north, you wouldn't like a chili pepper. Obviously, that's not true because people have different tastes. But for the most part, people who live in hot climate cultures, the vast majority tend to like chili peppers. And people who don't, it's almost like the further away from it, that climate you get, it's like the less people who like it. And that's because these cultures have used chili peppers and spices and stuff like that for thousands of years as a preservative to keep like meat or other types of food from spoiling, if they couldn't use, the cold like other people could. So there's just things like that that have been like, just part of one's culture and stuff. There's situational environmental factors that influence our hunger as well, like different situations, you eat different foods at different times around different people and stuff like that. All of that together is known as the ecology of eating, which is a study, like a subset. And they look at situations where, we eat because others are eating. Portion sizes that are offered, your book talks extensively about, it's a pretty cool read. They're looking at Europeans and basically seeing why Europeans had a smaller waist size by and large than Americans. And they were studying the same people and they were doing generally the same amount of stuff in terms of like what their job requirement was, what kind of foods they ate, how much they worked out or didn't. Like they were getting similar data. So they're like, it's not necessarily just genetic because people could obviously move between Europe and America. And they found what it was portion sizes. When you get food at a restaurant or they cook it or you buy it at the grocery store or you buy a snack at the gas station, whatever it is, portion sizes in Europe are by and large much smaller than in America. I mean, you think about it, sometimes we go to those fast food places, you get like a drink like this big. Like, let's be real. Do we need that? Do we need that? Do we need that? Right. But if you have it, like you're going to drink it. Like you don't want to waste it or you don't even notice you're drinking it because you're just sipping on it, sipping on it, sipping on it. Next thing you know, it's gone. And think of like all those additional calories you got when you could have just had like a normal size drink and been fine. And especially if it's something like high sugary, like, soft drink or something, then it could be really bad. So it was the portion sizes. So they would do these studies where they set out like portion sizes for people to grab, like a half a pretzel stick or a long pretzel stick or just a little bit of M&Ms, the bowl of M&Ms, like all these type things. Didn't matter what culture, what continent, everyone grabbed the larger one. Everyone did, by and large amount. I guess some people grabbed the smaller ones. Maybe they weren't really hungry, but like overall, people grabbed the larger ones. So it's almost to say like we want more food. We like how it tastes. We want more. We almost don't even know when to stop, right? But if you give people only the option of the smaller one, they'll take the smaller one. And they won't be necessarily wishing for more because that's like all they know. So it's kind of like in Europe, that's all they know is a portion size. They're not wishing for more. Whereas you think of our portion sizes here, they're pretty large a lot of times. Most of us aren't wishing for more because that's all we know. You see what I'm saying? So it's like if we knew less, that would help us more. And food variety talks about the more variety you have, the more you tend to eat. You probably noticed this at some type of like at a buffet, at a party, you're like, well, I want to try this and this and this and this. And even if you're only putting a little bit on your plate, at like a family reunion where it's like a potluck or something like that at church or something, you get done. And how full is that plate? Like you think of your plate at supper, you throw some spaghetti on it, throw some chicken or something. All right, but you got space around the edge of the plate. I don't know about you, but if I go through like a church potluck and I come down, I might just have little bits. I did a little scoop. But daggone it, I got like everything. I put my spoon like everywhere. There's like not a square inch on my plate where things, are not like touching or piled to the edge. So if you looked at my two plates, this one has way more food. So they found that the more variety of food you have, the more you eat too. So the last part of this section of notes is talking about basically just obesity and weight control. So we did nature, physiological stuff, physiology of hunger. And we did nurture, environmental stuff, the psychology of hunger. And so now we're looking at obesity and weight control. So obesity can be socially toxic. It can affect how you're treated. It can affect how you feel about yourself, and then how you feel in general. It has been associated with lower psychological well-being, and especially for women. Women tend to take it harder, and they get discriminated more for their weight and stuff like that. 'Cause I think there's probably higher beauty standards for women and stuff, so it's a lot harder. So if you're wondering what exactly obesity is, I got a scale on the next page I'll show you. So there's this thing called the BMI. You've probably done it before. There's way more accurate ways to get your BMI than looking on the scale I have, but it's all I can do. There's things where you like pinch certain parts of your body. You probably remember it from like gym class and stuff like that. There's scales you can get on, send little electrical currents through your body and measure how much fat it had to go through. So there's all kinds of crazy stuff. But there's a basic scale on the next page of like your height and weight to give you an idea. So if someone has a BMI of over 30, that would be considered obese. If someone has a BMI of over 25, that would be considered overweight. Obviously, the United States has a huge overweight obesity problem. It has doubled, just in your grandparents' lifetime. And it shows, unfortunately, no sign of slowing down. I mean, every year, the number of total Americans who are obese, adult and children, is higher than the year before. Like, it's not dipped. And this I found was interesting. Your book was talking about, I touched it. I made this little thing pop up. Hold on. I'm going to make it go away so you can read it. No country in the world has reduced their obesity rate in the last, I think it was 40 years or something. No country in the world, which is crazy because there's places in the world that are a lot healthier than we are here. But it's just kind of this universal phenomenon right now, which is pretty crazy. So here's a BMI, weights across the top. So you can find weight. Height is over here on the side, and basically you just find things and make them line up, and you can, look at the colors to see. Obviously, optimal normal would be blue. The yellows are underweight or overweight. Obese would be orange, and then the red and green are severely underweight and severely obese. You can pause it and play around with that for a minute if you are interested. All right, so obesity also increases the risk of health problems, which should be no surprise to anyone: diabetes, high blood pressure, certain types of cancers, heart disease, and plenty more. Plus just an overall shorter life expectancy and quality of life, that type of thing. This is what I thought was so fascinating. I've never heard this before in my life, and so they're starting to study it more to see the relationship. But there is a correlation, not causation, but a correlation between obesity and then cognitive decline later in life, specifically Alzheimer's. So obviously everyone that has Alzheimer's is not necessarily obese. Everybody who's obese doesn't get Alzheimer's. But there's enough of a, interaction, a relationship to make it significant, and researchers are looking more into that. So that is really interesting, because if you're like me, you think of these things up here, but you think of the body, not the mind, which is pretty wild. And like I was explaining to you earlier, fat has a lower basal metabolic rate, so it takes less food to maintain that weight. Lean people actually need more food, more calories to maintain, because they're burning more calories than an overweight person. So it's they can eat more to maintain, whereas an overweight person would have to eat less to maintain. And you think they would eat more because they're overweight. Twin studies and adopted studies have showed us, again, going back to that nature, nurture, have showed us the genetic component, the strong genetic influence on weight. Your book talks about how, you could have, an adopted child in a family. They could eat the same plate for supper, breakfast, lunch, and supper as their sibling for however many years. But their weight is not going to be like their sibling's weight, or their adopted sibling's weight is what I'm talking about, or their adopted parents. It's going to be like that of their birth parents, their birth mother, birth father, birth siblings, stuff like that, kind of showing the really strong genetic link. And then again, going to the nurture, to the environment, but there's still the environmental factors, right? There's, lack of sleep. That's an environmental factor. For whatever reason, if people don't get enough sleep, there's a correlation between that and weight gain. There's higher instances of obesity if a loved one of theirs is obese. So a family member, a spouse, a good friend, stuff like that. If they're, and maybe you tend to see this, right? it's almost like maybe it's more accepted, or maybe they're, eating the same foods, living in the same household, doing the same things, so maybe it led to the same, same decisions led to the same outcome, that kind of thing. Food consumption, like the type of food, this should be a no-brainer. The type of food you eat and the amount of food you eat obviously leads to it, and that's an environmental, that's a nurture, that's something you choose. It has nothing to do with your genes. That's a decision you make. Plus, just an overall decreased activity level. So jobs today are becoming even more sedentary. I don't know about you guys. I'm sure you are. You're way more sedentary now than you have been. I am in this pandemic. I was telling my husband about, I did not realize how much I walked today around the classroom, to and from my desk, back and forth, just little walks, right? I mean, like I'll sit up front and teach and stuff like that, but I was constantly like, to get the phone, to pass something out, to this, to that, and how many times I walked down the hallway to the copier to eat lunch, to go to the bathroom, back to the printer, back to the copier, and up and down the stairs to work and back to my car. And then if I ran errands after work, like all the way through Target, that's a lot of walking, and I miss doing that. To get my kids from this place and get them, like, there's just so many steps I would take in a day. And I swear now it's like the steps, like to my bedroom, to the kitchen, to the bathroom, to the living room, back to my bedroom, back to my kitchen, back to the bathroom, back to the living room. And they're all like right by each other. And I spend so much time just like sitting here, filming to you guys, or just typing out all these PowerPoints, grading it, typing all the emails, reading all the stuff in the textbook, making all the notes, whatever it is that I'm working on. I swear I'm like sitting at my desk in front of a computer right now. And while I did sit at my desk at school, I mean, don't get me wrong, I had to work. It's just not the same. And so I can tell right now, my activity level is tanking, right? But I think I probably have a more active job than a lot of people. But there's a lot of people who kind of, how I'm living right now is how they live. Like they sit at a computer all day. Like they turn around to go to the printer, turn around to get this. They only get up if they have to go, to the bathroom or go get something to eat, and that's it. And so those jobs are becoming more the norm, like being on a computer, being in an office, being in a cubicle, stuff like that. And so there's just a decreased activity level overall, and so that impacts it. Also got a chart here kind of showing you all the countries over the years and the proportion of people who have become overweight. You can see in the United States, 3/4 of the population is considered overweight or obese, which is pretty crazy. And as America likes to do, we're the best. America #1, the USA is #1. And so we are #1 with overweight and obesity too, unfortunately. And that is it for section 2. See you guys back for the next one later. Bye.